Imagine dying and, expecting this blissful, heart-filled paradise, only to realize that the ancient texts they were never talking about the afterlife at all.
Right.
Like, imagine waking up to the realization that what you thought was this poetic promise of a post-mortem resort was actually a really rigorous thermodynamic blueprint for fixing society right now.
Yeah, I mean, it is the ultimate paradigm shift. We're dealing with an ancient text here that has been, well, it's basically been buried under centuries of mythology.
Oh, completely.
And once you strip that mythology away, what you actually find underneath is this highly advanced socioeconomic model.
So welcome everyone to another custom-tailored deep dive. Today we're taking a sledgehammer to a really profoundly misunderstood segment of the Quran, specifically Surah Maryam, Ayat 62 through 67. And we are analyzing this through the lens of the Totally Islam digital audio lecture, specifically lecture 10 out of 13. And our mission today is simple, but pretty massive.
It's huge, yeah.
We are dismantling the otherworldly theme park view of paradise.
Because that mythological lens, it just reduces an incredibly advanced sociological framework into like a passive fairy tale.
Right.
I mean, if you look at the traditional classical interpretation, it paints this picture of believers just lounging around in a celestial garden after they die.
Eating magical food that just like appears every morning and evening.
Exactly, yeah. And they never hear a bad word.
Yeah.
Angels are floating around telling them that God never forgets. It's entirely passive. It asks absolutely nothing of the intellect.
And it's a vision that, honestly, it feels a bit like a waiting room.
Yes.
You just kind of endure the misery of the real world, hoping you get your ticket punched for the VIP lounge in the sky. But if you are listening to this right now, like if you work a 50 or 60-hour week, if you feel crushed by bureaucratic red tape or systemic inefficiency or just, the sheer noise of modern civilization, this text is actually addressing you.
Correctly, yeah.
It is detailing the operational anatomy of a highly optimized, completely friction-free social order for the living.
And to understand how it does this, we have to look at the first core metric the text establishes for this optimized society.
Okay, let's get into it.
The verse states that in this state of existence, there is no law.
Right.
Now, if you look at a standard traditional translation, law is usually rendered as, vain talk or swearing or profanity.
Which sounds like the rule book for a middle school classroom.
Right, exactly.
No bad words allowed. It's an oddly trivial foundation for a supposedly perfect society.
Yeah, it really is.
Because if the pinnacle of human achievement is just people not cursing at each other, that feels incredibly hollow.
The Tulu Islam lecture argues that it is hollow because that translation completely misses the scope of the Arabic root.
Oh, interesting.
In the context of social physics, law does not just mean swearing. It refers to systemic noise.
Systemic noise.
Yes. It is intellectual pollution. It represents actions, policies, or communications that just produce no constructive value whatsoever.
Wow, okay.
So if you want to use a modern equivalent, law is the endless corporate jargon in a meaningless meaning.
Oh, I know that well.
Right. It is the algorithmic doom scrolling that's designed to harvest your attention without enriching your mind.
So it's essentially just waste.
Precisely. In thermodynamic terms, when you operate a machine, any friction in that machine results in energy lost as heat.
Right. The system bleeds energy.
And that lost energy is law. It is a society bleeding its potential through meaningless friction. In Quranic terminology, this concept of meaningless destructive action is called batil.
Okay.
The opposite of that, the purposeful, structurally sound and constructive action, is haq.
But let me push back on that a little bit because eliminating noise or waste sounds great in a physics textbook, right?
Sure.
But applying that to human beings is incredibly messy. If we try to define what is purposeful and what is noise in a society, who gets to decide that?
Right, that's the danger.
Because historically, when a state decides it wants to eliminate quote-unquote useless talk, we end up with authoritarian censorship.
That is a crucial distinction to make. The text is not advocating for an authoritarian suppression of speech.
Okay.
The lecture contrasts this optimized society with the historical human attempts to escape law. Because historically, how did people try to find this pure, noise-free state?
They became ascetics. They went into monasteries.
Exactly. They sat in caves.
Right. I mean, you can't have systemic noise if you just completely remove yourself from the system.
But isolation is a society of one. If you are alone in a room, of course there is no law, because there's no communication at all.
Right.
What the text is outlining is the vastly more difficult achievement of an active, bustling, highly interconnected social machinery.
So it's not about silencing people.
No, the elimination of law isn't achieved by taping people's mouths shut. It is achieved by elevating the purpose of their interactions.
Oh, I see.
It is a state where human beings interact constantly, but the communication and the economic exchanges are so highly aligned with human development that the friction just naturally drops to zero.
Which means we really need to understand what replaces the noise then.
Yes.
If the friction is gone, what is the lubricant keeping this active society moving?
Right.
The text states that instead of law, they only hear salam.
Salam, yes.
And I know the default translation for salam is peace, but based on what we just discussed, I'm guessing peace is another one of those kindergarten-level reductions.
It is fundamentally inadequate. The problem with the English word peace is that we almost entirely define it in the negative.
What do you mean?
We define peace as the absence of war, or the absence of conflict, or the absence of fear. Two nations sign an armistice, they stop bombing each other, and we call it peace.
Even if the citizens of those nations are starving,
Exactly.
or culturally stagnant or oppressed by their own leaders. I mean, a graveyard is technically peaceful, but it's not exactly the model for a thriving civilization.
That's a great way to put it. To grasp what the text is actually proposing here, we have to look at the Arabic root of the word.
Yeah.
Sin lam mim, SLM. This is the root for salam, and it is also the root for Islam and Muslim. In classical Arabic vocabulary, this root does not mean a passive absence of conflict.
What does it mean?
It means completion, it means perfection, wholeness, and the fulfillment of latent potential.
Completion. Wow. That completely changes the dynamic of the traditional greeting, doesn't it?
It really does.
When someone says Assalamu alaikum, they aren't just saying a polite, passive, peace be upon you.
They are declaring a profound, active social contract. From the Tului Islam perspective, when a citizen of this society says, Assalamu alaikum, they're saying, I will be a source of completion for your personality.
That is heavy.
I will act as the instrument through which you reach your full human potential, and you are entirely secure from any systemic harm coming from me.
I will be a source of completion for your personality. That is an incredibly high bar for a social interaction.
Yes.
Let me try to contextualize this for you, the listener, because the source material uses a really compelling analogy here regarding the parts of a watch.
Right, the watch analogy.
If we think about a tiny, meticulously crafted gear from a Swiss watch, if you take that gear and you just leave it sitting on a wooden table all by itself, it might be flawlessly manufactured. It has perfect teeth, but sitting there alone, it is completely useless. It cannot fulfill its purpose. It cannot tell time.
And this is exactly where the critique of extreme individualism comes in.
Okay.
Because in a hyper-individualistic society, everyone is just trying to be the shiniest gear on the table. Everyone is focused purely on their own accumulation, their own personal salvation, or their own isolated perfection.
But a gear only finds its salam, its completion, when you pick it up and place it inside the watch casing.
Yes, the moment its teeth interlock perfectly with the gear next to it.
Right.
When one gear turns, it enables the next gear to turn. That frictionless cooperation where every individual piece acts as an enabler for the piece next to it, allowing the entire mechanism to fulfill its purpose, that is salam.
So it's mutual completion.
It is a state of mutual completion. It means an optimized society cannot be individualistic by definition. Your completion is intrinsically mechanically tied to the completion of your neighbor.
Because if someone in your society is left isolated on the table, the watch doesn't work.
Exactly. The system fails.
But this introduces a massive practical problem, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, mutual completion sounds beautiful in theory, but if the listener right now is trying to figure out how to pay their mortgage this month, or they're worrying about affording health care, they don't have the bandwidth to be a source of completion for someone else's personality.
No, of course not.
If you are starving, you are entirely focused on survival. So how does this text bridge the gap between this lofty sociological ideal and the brutal reality of human economics?
The text actually anticipates that exact bottleneck.
Really?
Yes. This is why the very next phrase addresses the economic baseline. It states that provision rizqis provided morning and evening, which in Arabic is bukratan wa ashiyyo.
Okay, let me pause you right there, because this is the part of the classical interpretation that sounds the most like a fairy tale.
The magical food.
Exactly. Magical food appearing out of thin air twice a day. A celestial buffet.
And the Tului Islam lecture dismantles that completely.
Right.
First, we need to redefine risk. In this paradigm, risk is not just a plate of dates or loaves of bread. Risk encompasses the complete material and intellectual supply chain necessary for human development.
So it's infrastructure.
It means housing, medical care, nutrition, education, and all the resources necessary to cultivate the intellect.
And the phrase, bukratan wa ashiya, morning and evening.
It is a classical Arabic idiom. It does not literally mean a delivery truck shows up at 8 a.m. and 6 p.m.
Right.
In the linguistic context of the era, morning and evening implies continuous, uninterrupted perpetuity. It means around the clock.
204/7.
Yes. So the text is describing an economic distribution system that runs on a 247 continuous self-sustaining loop. There are no bottlenecks. There is no artificial scarcity.
I have to play the skeptic here again.
Go ahead.
Because if you say guaranteed material supply chain for everyone without scarcity, a modern listener hears failed utopian state.
Sure, they think of the 20th century.
Right. We have seen attempts in the 20th century to guarantee everyone housing and food, and they often collapsed under massive bureaucratic friction or corruption or just a total lack of production.
Yeah.
How is this blueprint differentiating itself from, say, a failed communist command economy?
That is a phenomenal question. The difference lies in the philosophical bedrock of why this supply chain exists in the first place.
Okay, unpack that.
The lecture draws a sharp contrast between human life and animal life to explain this. Consider a beast of burden, a mule, for instance. From the perspective of the system that uses the mule, what is the purpose of the mule's existence?
To carry weight, to do labor.
Right. And why does the mule eat? It eats so that it can maintain enough physical energy to wake up the next day and carry more weight.
The biological loop of the animal is completely closed.
Exactly. It works to eat, and it eats to work. Securing food is the ultimate final horizon of its existence.
Which, if we're being brutally honest, is exactly how the modern global economy treats the average human being.
Yes, it is.
We work a job we tolerate just to pay the rent and buy groceries, so we have the caloric energy to wake up Monday morning and go back to the job. We are trapped in the beast of burden loop.
And any economic system, whether it's capitalist or state communist, that views the securing of basic biological needs as the ultimate goal of the citizen's life is fundamentally reducing the human to an animal state.
Wow.
The Quranic critique here is that as long as human beings are entirely consumed by the existential anxiety of survival, they cannot possibly achieve their higher human potential. They cannot engage in salam.
It's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but applied as a macroeconomic legal requirement.
Exactly. In this highly optimized society, securing your basic needs is not the goal of your life. It is merely the prerequisite. The lecture uses the concept of a journey. If you want to travel across the country on a train, you have to buy a ticket.
Sure.
But the ticket itself is not the destination.
Right. Nobody buys a train ticket, stares at it, and says, well, I've achieved my life's purpose.
Exactly.
The ticket just gets you onto the train so you can actually take the journey.
The guaranteed continuous supply chain, the risk bukratan wa ashia, is the train ticket.
Oh, I see.
Once a society has structured itself to automate and guarantee the economic baseline so that absolutely no citizen lives in fear of starvation, homelessness, or medical bankruptcy, then the real human journey begins.
The journey of scientific discovery, of artistic creation, of cosmic exploration, of actually completing the personalities of the people around you.
Yes. The tragedy of modern civilization is that we spend our entire finite lives exhausting our intellects just trying to afford the ticket.
And the vast majority of humanity never actually gets to board the train.
Never.
That is a devastating realization, but it also makes the blueprint incredibly cohesive. Well, if you want a society with zero systemic noise, zero law, you must cultivate mutual completion, Salam.
Right.
But people can't engage in mutual completion if they are fighting over scraps of food. Therefore, you must build an economic system that guarantees uninterrupted provision, risk. The logic locks together perfectly.
It does.
Okay.
But any system this sophisticated, no matter how logically sound, is incredibly fragile if it isn't governed properly.
Yeah, that makes sense.
A continuous supply chain can be hoarded. A system of mutual completion can be exploited by bad actors, which is why the text specifies exactly who inherits and runs this society.
Okay, who?
The text declares that this state is an inheritance warasat for the taqiyya.
Okay, let's unpack those two words, because inheritance and taqiyya both have very loaded traditional meaning.
I do.
When I hear inheritance, I immediately think of like a trust fund dynamic, someone passively receiving their father's property without having done a single day of work to earn it. Bloodline wealth. Is that the mechanism here?
Far from it. The lecture meticulously redefines inheritance in this context. It is not about passively receiving property through a bloodline, and it is certainly not about divine nepotism.
What is it then?
Wirasat, in the Quranic sociological sense, means gaining ownership, control, and stewardship of the earth's resources based entirely on merit and capability.
Merit.
Yes. You don't inherit the system because of who your parents are. You inherit the system because your actions align with the physical and moral laws required to sustain it.
It's the difference between inheriting a functioning airplane because your dad owned the airline versus inheriting the pilot seat because you actually know how to fly the plane without crashing it.
That is exactly the distinction. And the people who know how to fly the plane are the Taqiyya,
Which usually gets translated as the pious or the people who fear God.
which again strips the concept of its operational utility. Fear of God is a passive emotional state.
Right.
But structurally, the Arabic root of taqwa means to guard, to protect, to exercise supreme discipline, and to avoid systemic imbalance.
So it's not about an individual sitting in a room feeling terrified of divine punishment. It's an active institutional role.
Yes, the taqiyya are those individuals who exercise supreme institutional discipline. They are the guardians of the social state.
The guardians.
They possess the intellectual rigor and the self-control required to guard the society against structural violations, corruption, and the reintroduction of law.
So they're the ones maintaining the system.
They're the ones who manage the 247 supply chain without skimming from it. They maintain the mechanics of the watch.
But how does someone prove they are one of the Taqiyya? Because in our modern political systems, we choose our guardians through popularity contests.
Right, elections.
We vote for the person with the best marketing campaign or the most funding, and then we are shocked when they act out of self-interest rather than institutional discipline. Does the text provide a mechanism for how this meritocracy actually functions?
The text provides the foundational operating system that the taqiyya must adhere to. This brings us to a massive philosophical shift in the narrative.
Okay, let's go there.
Because a society can't just decree zero friction and perfect guardians without a universal logic holding it up. In verses 64 and 65, the text introduces the engine of reason that powers this entire socioeconomic blueprint.
This is where we hear the voice of the cosmic forces, right?
Yes.
The text quotes the angels, the Malaika, stating, "We do not descend except by the command of your sustainer."
Consider how radical this statement was in its historical context and how relevant it remains today.
Why is it radical?
Because for millennia, human beings believed the universe operated on erratic supernatural whims.
Right. If there was a drought, it was because the rain god was angry. If the harvest was good, it was because the earth goddess was happy. The
Exactly.
universe was viewed as a chaotic, emotional entity that needed to be appeased.
And that superstitious mindset creates a very specific kind of human society. If you believe the universe is governed by arbitrary emotion, you will build arbitrary, corrupt human institutions.
Oh, that makes total sense.
You will think you can bribe the gods with a sacrifice. And if you can bribe the gods, you can certainly bribe a judge or a king or a supply chain manager.
Because there is no concept of absolute unbreakable law. Everything is negotiable if you have enough leverage.
Exactly. But in this verse, the cosmic forces, which represent the laws of nature, physics, chemistry, biology, explicitly state, we do not operate on whim. We do not act randomly. We only manifest and execute our functions by the command of the sustainer.
And the word for command here is amr.
Amr, yes.
Let's dig into that because it sounds like we're talking about a legal framework, not just a vocal order.
Amr is a rigid, mathematically flawless, law-abiding framework. The forces of gravity, the thermodynamic cycles, the orbits of the planets, they are entirely locked into this unbreakable operating system.
There are no exceptions.
None. The universe does not have cheat codes. You cannot bribe gravity to ignore you. You cannot flatter a chemical reaction into changing its yield. The physical universe operates on an absolute rule of law.
And the implication for human society is profound.
It is.
Because if the universe is running on an unbreakable, mathematically perfect operating system, then human social systems must mirror this absolute predictability if they want to escape collapse.
Yes.
We can't build a society on superstition, nepotism, and erratic human emotions and expect it to survive because it is out of alignment with the very fabric of reality.
That is the core thesis of the Tulu'i Islam interpretation. The Taqiyya, the guardians of the state, are simply the individuals who align human legislation with the absolute predictability of universal law.
So they just mirror the cosmos.
Exactly. They recognize that if you oppress a class of people or if you build an economy based on infinite debt and artificial scarcity, you are violating the Amaran. You are rebelling against the mathematics of the cosmos.
And the cosmos doesn't care about your excuses.
Now, the cosmos will always correct a mathematical error eventually.
The universe keeps receipts.
It absolutely does. Which leads directly into one of the most mind-bending concepts in this lecture, the archive of time.
Okay, this part is wild.
Immediately after establishing this cosmic rule of law, the text states that the sustainer owns what is before us, what is behind us, and what is between them. It concludes with an incredibly heavy phrase, and your Lord never forgets.
Right. What is behind us is the past. What is before us is the future. And what is between them is the present microsecond.
Yes.
So this is a total metaphysical assertion over the nature of time itself?
The lecture takes a deep thermodynamic view of this. Think about how we usually experience history. We view the past as something that is gone, vanished, deleted.
Yeah, it's just memories.
We think that if someone commits a corrupt act in the dark, and no human being sees it, that act disappears into the void of the past without a trace.
But the text says your Lord never forgets. It's portraying the universe as a flawless, indestructible cosmic server.
In the physical sciences, we understand this through the law of conservation of mass and energy. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, it merely changes form.
Okay, I felt
The Quranic philosophy extends this physical law into the realm of human sociology and moral action. Every single action, every thought, every systemic policy is an input of energy into the cosmic server.
it's all logged.
It is never lost. It always produces an effect.
I want you, the listener, to really internalize the weight of this, because if you are listening to this, think about the relief and, frankly, the terror of this concept.
Mostly the terror for a lot of people.
Seriously, the terror is that you cannot hide your law. You cannot hide the systemic friction you cause. You might get away with it in the human court system.
You might exploit the supply chain and die a rich person thinking you won the game.
But the cosmic server logged the input, and it will eventually produce a mathematical consequence on the society you leave behind.
It shatters the illusion of getting away with anything. History is not a series of random accidents. A civilization collapses not because of bad luck, but because the accumulation of their destructive actions, their batil, finally reached a mathematical tipping point in the archive of time.
But there is an immense relief to this as well, isn't there?
Absolutely.
The relief is knowing that every constructive effort you make, every time you act as Salam to help complete someone else's personality, even if it goes completely unrewarded by the current broken system, the universe has logged it permanently.
Yes.
Ultimate justice isn't a fairy tale hope. It is a mechanical certainty embedded in the fabric of space-time.
Yes. The law of requital guarantees that you reap exactly what you sow, not just on an individual level, but on a macro-societal level. But the text understands human psychology deeply.
It knows we're going to resist this.
Exactly. It knows that when you present this grand, cosmic, mathematical view of history to a human being, the immediate reaction is often cynical rejection.
Which brings us to the psychological bottleneck of Al-Insan, the human being. In verses 66 and 67, the text anticipates the ultimate pushback from the materialist mind.
It quotes the skeptic directly. The text says, and the human being says, when I am dead, shall I really be brought forth alive?
Now, if we look at the traditional interpretation, this is just a literal question about biological resurrection.
Right, the physical body.
A man looking at a corpse in a grave and saying, you expect me to believe these bones are going to reassemble and walk around again?
And while the text absolutely encompasses the reality of life after death, the Tolu Islam lecture applies the lens of social physics to extract the immediate earthly application of this verse.
Okay, what is the earthly application?
Sociologically, this is a profound critique of the short-sighted, materialist mind looking at a collapsed, dead civilization.
Oh, this is fascinating. So instead of a biological corpse, think of a societal corpse.
Imagine standing in the ruins of a collapsed empire. Or, to make it more relevant to today, imagine looking at a completely corrupt, economically devastated, highly polarized modern nation.
It's not hard to imagine.
Right. The institutions are hollowed out, the supply chains are broken, the culture is drowning in law.
If we are honest, many people listening to this probably feel that way about our current global situation.
They absolutely do.
You look at the news, you see the environmental decay, the extreme wealth inequality, the political gridlock, and it is so easy to say, the system is dead. Our society is completely cooked. It has turned to dust.
That is the voice of Al-Insan in this verse. When our civilization is dead, shall it really be brought forth alive.
It is the ultimate despair of the materialist who only sees the current decay.
Yes, they cannot conceptualize the regenerative power of the cosmic law. They think it's impossible to rebuild an equitable, friction-free society from the rot of the current one.
And how does the text answer that cynicism? Because telling a cynic to just have faith never works. You can't fight empirical despair with a magical platitude.
The Quran does not offer a magical platitude. The law of requital fires back with hard, undeniable, empirical data.
Empirical data.
Yes. Verse 67 answers the skeptic by pointing to their own origin. It says, "Does the human not remember that we created him before while he was nothing?"
Well, he was nothing.
The Arabic phrase is lam yakun shay, meaning he was not a thing. Absolute nothingness.
Look at your own origin vector. That is a brilliant rhetorical move.
The lecture urges the listener to consider the evolutionary history of human consciousness. Go back millions of years.
Yeah.
The complex, self-aware human mind. The intellect, capable of pondering the archive of time, capable of building computers, capable of feeling despair. It did not exist.
It was lam yakushe.
Exactly. But the cosmic system, operating strictly on those rigid divine laws of physics, chemistry, and biology, developed this massive complexity out of a zero state.
From cosmic dust to single-celled organisms to complex neural networks.
Yeah.
So if I'm like a software engineer, it's the equivalent of looking at a completely blank piece of silicon, an absolute zero state, and wondering how it could ever become a self-learning AI.
That's a perfect analogy.
The universe has already written the ultimate code from scratch. If the natural laws of reality possess the architectural capacity to execute that initial complex input from absolute nothingness, then taking a society that is merely decayed, a society that already has human capital, historical data, and resources, and restructuring it back into a state of salam is mathematically elementary.
That is the precise logic the text employs. It is a mathematical proof of concept.
Wow.
Rebuilding a society, shifting it from a state of chaotic decay into a state of optimized 204/7 risk and zero law does not require supernatural magic.
It just requires physics.
The universe has already proven its capacity for complex creation. It simply requires human beings to align their social operating system with the universal laws that already exist.
The laws of sociology are just as reliable as the laws of biology. If the cosmos can build a human brain out of stardust, human beings can certainly build a friction-free society out of the ruins of a corrupt one. The blueprint is fully viable.
It is entirely viable, provided we utilize the engine of reason and adhere to the discipline of the Taqwa. It is a complete intellectual upgrade from the fairy tale we started with.
I am taking a very deep breath here because synthesizing this entire journey is heavy.
There's a lot to take in.
We have moved from a passive post-mortem waiting room to a highly engineered thermodynamic social blueprint.
Yes.
We've replaced magical thinking with the cosmic defense of law and the unbreakable archive of time. And we've defeated ultimate cynicism with the empirical data of our own evolutionary origin vector.
We have outlined the anatomy of the perfect system.
But there is a massive but hanging over this entire conversation.
There we go.
The blueprint for an optimized society is locked in. The intellectual defense is absolute, but we know human nature. What happens to the people who refuse to play ball?
The enemies of the rational order.
Yes.
No?
What happens to the status quo elites? The corrupt politicians, the hoarders of the supply chain, the people who weaponize law to keep the masses distracted because the current broken system makes them incredibly wealthy and powerful.
They're not just going to step aside.
Exactly. They aren't just going to read this blueprint and voluntarily give up their leverage. They will stubbornly refuse to upgrade their mental operating systems. So how does the universe and this mathematical law for requital deal with the unyielding enemies of this rational order?
The system rounds them up under their own laws of self-destruction.
Self-destruction?
The universe does not need to strike them with a supernatural lightning bolt. Their own friction burns them to the ground.
Wow.
In Lecture 11 out of 13, the analysis moves to the next sequence in Surah Maryam, Ayat 68 through 75, and that is where we witness the ultimate legal and systemic clustering of the rebellious elites.
We see how the system handles them.
We see how the law of requital systematically separates the corrupt from the constructive, allowing the obsolete to collapse under the crushing weight of its own batil.
The countdown principle in action. The archive of time has a sequence. It will not be rushed, but it absolutely will not be stopped.
See you in the next session for that one.
That is an incredible place to pause our analysis. We will definitely dive into that systemic collapse in the next session. But as we wrap up this deep dive into the source material, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, highly practical thought to mull over.
Hmm.
We've spent this time looking at the macro-level structural skeleton of an optimized society. Zero law, mutual salam, a 247 guaranteed supply of risk, all governed by the discipline of the Taqiyya aligning with the universal Amter.
Right, big picture.
But a society is just the sum of its individual parts. You are one of those parts. You are an input generating data into the archive of time right now.
Every single day.
So think about your own daily interactions. When you log onto social media, when you sit in a corporate meeting, when you talk to your family, are you contributing law?
Are you adding friction?
Are you just adding to the noise, the friction, and the intellectual pollution of a dying system? Are you creating waste? Or are you a source of salam? Are you acting as that vital interlocking watch gear that completes and elevates the people around you? Are you preparing yourself to be capable of guarding the system?
That's the real test.
Because the blueprint for paradise isn't waiting in the clouds for you after you die. The mechanical laws to build it are already humming in the fabric of the universe around you. The real question is whether you are willing to discipline yourself enough to inherit it.
Absolutely.
Thank you for joining us on this intellectual journey today. Stay curious, keep stripping away the mythology to find the structural truth beneath, and as always, keep questioning the traditional narratives.